So I'm going to talk a little bit about genetics, which I know a fair bit about. And here are two children that I cloned earlier. These are my sons, and they're identical twins. So one of the first things people worry about when they get MS is, is this a genetic disease? Is it, is it in our family? Am I going to pass it on, etc., etc., etc.? And I can tell you that, in fact, genetics is only a very small part of this. There is no MS gene that people can pass on. So if you look at identical twins and they have the same genes, the identical genes, every single gene they have is the same, and they're in the same womb as fetus, they go to the same school, they get the same bugs, they share the same room, they eat the same food. When they're teenagers, they might even date the same girl if one of them's busy one night. Yet if one twin were to get MS, the lifetime risk of the other twin getting MS is only 1 in 5, even though everything else in their life, including their genes, is identical. So, no, it's not a disease. There's one gene and we can do a blood test and tell that people have got MS. But we have done a lot of work in genetics, and here's one example where we've identified certain genes that are associated with MS. That doesn't mean they're causing MS, but they're associated with MS. And there's been worldwide studies, again, which we've been involved with looking at genes. And it's now getting quite ridiculous because we found over 150 different genes which are associated with MS, which I would guarantee I would probably have about 130 of those 150. But what this tells us is that what is the machinery that's involved when someone has MS? I could give you another example. We all know that cholesterol can be associated with heart attack and stroke. But if we look at the genes for cholesterol, we find an association, but it's very weak, the genes for cholesterol. But if we find a tablet that can look after that gene or that protein, it can make a huge difference to health. So the reason we look at this is to try and understand how MS happens, and so we can design better and more effective treatments. And it doesn't matter if you look at other countries like, say, China, which we did here. It's actually all the same machinery. So it is the same disease. It doesn't matter whether you live in Timbuktu or Applecross. And this science has got to a point where this is the previous 100 years before 2007, the number of publications on the genes in MS, and then it's the first half of 2007, second half, so each one of these things is 6 months. And you can see the discoveries in the last 10 years have been exponential, and that translates into better treatments and ultimately, we hope, cure. But the danger, of course, with knowing all this about genetics is for people to blame everything on genetics, like this. But clearly, genetics is not the answer here. Genetics is a solution that gives us the tools to move before finding the answer. Some people quite cynically have said, like Dr. Hawkes here, he said, well, what's wrong with the environmental theory of MS? In a word, nothing. And of course he's quite right. There are environmental influences because if you shift from one country to another country, you tend to adopt the risk of whichever country you move to. So if you're Cantonese and your family have grown up in Hong Kong and then in 1997 you moved to Canada, 15 years later your risk of MS is becoming more like Canadians rather than people that live in Hong Kong. Now, another thing you might not know about genetics is genetics influences things which we know are not genetic. So, for example, this peach colour is identical twins. The blue colour is non-identical twins. So if a condition is, inverted commas, genetic, you'd expect identical twins to have pretty much the same risk, but fraternal twins, non-identical twins, to be a bit more like brother and sister. And here's MS, and sure, if you're an identical twin, as I mentioned, you've got a higher risk of getting MS than if you're a non-identical twin. But this bar, which is even more high risk if you're an identical twin, is polio. And this bar is rickets. which is due to lack of sunshine and vitamin D. So what this shows is you might think just because someone in a family has got some risk doesn't mean it's necessarily genetic. It might be if you're an identical twin, you like doing all the same things, and that's what changes your risk. You know, we might need to look at that from the other direction.